Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the things that you need to look out for if you're buying a first generation Toyota Sequoia. I'm going to show you all the common issues and quirks that these models have, how to spot them, and also do a proper test drive before you purchase the vehicle so you know you're getting a solid deal. Before we get started with the video, let's have a quick summary of what kind of vehicle the Sequoia is and its basic specifications. The first generation Toyota Sequoia is a full-size SUV that was manufactured from the years 2001 through 2007. For those of you who are more familiar with trucks, the first generation Toyota Tundra is very similar to the Sequoia. They share the same engine, dashboard, sheet metal, and chassis. The engine that powers this car has the designation 2UZ-FE from Toyota. This is actually the very same engine that comes standard in the 100 series Toyota Land Cruiser and the second generation Lexus LX470. It's a well-proven and extremely reliable engine which has been known to last over 200,000 miles with regular maintenance. The 2UZ engine used in the model years 2001 through 2004 outputs 240 horsepower. With the introduction of variable valve timing in 2005, this figure was bumped up by 40 horsepower. There are also two different flavors of the transmissions used in these models. 2001 through 2004 models got a 4-speed automatic transmission, whereas the 2005 models and up got an extra gear making it a 5-speed transmission. Both of these transmissions come with an overdrive gear. With the summary out of the way, let's jump straight into the first and probably the most important issue that you need to look out for before buying any first generation Toyota Sequoia or Tundra: rust on the body and frame. We'll start from the front of the car and go backwards. The first area that you want to look at is the front wheel well just below the fender. Make sure these holes you see aren't expanding by driving a screwdriver through and seeing if there's any crumbliness. The next area is this front cross member a little behind the wheels. Again, poke a screwdriver through the holes that you can see and make sure that they are not rotting out from the inside. You can also use a hammer to tap lightly and make sure it does not go through anywhere. This is part of the frame which the entire weight of the body sits on, and therefore it should be structurally very sound. Next, we can move on to the part that the front cross member connects to, the frame rails. This is one of the most common rust areas on the first gen Sequoias or Tundras. Follow the frame rails on either side all the way back to the lower control arm mounting area in the back. Don't forget to inspect this welded area where the front cross member attaches to the frame rail to see if there are any cracks. Now we're at the rear of the car, where the lower control arm connects the suspension to the frame. This is another common rusting point on these cars. Inspect the welds and also the lower control arm bolt holes to make sure that they are nice and solid. Slightly in front of the lower control arm, you have the rear axle with the rear differential. If the rear diff pumpkin that you can see has a lot of rust on it, it can develop pinhole leaks over time and leak all the diff fluid out. This will destroy the differential. The final area that is notorious for body rust is the rear wheel arch. The door has a lip that covers this area, so you'll have to open the door to inspect it. Since most of this area is painted, you may not notice rust that is under it. Lightly tap the area with a hammer to make sure it's solid. Since we're currently under the car, it's a good time to knock out another one of the items on our list: lower ball joints. This is a common yet very important issue on many other Toyota models, not just this one. Since the lower ball joints in these cars are known to be a weak point, it's a good idea to replace them preventatively every 50 to 60,000 miles. If you're not able to find evidence of a lower ball joint replacement by the previous owner, make sure to do it as soon as you buy the car. A lower ball joint failure is catastrophic and causes thousands of dollars in damage to your car and injury or death. While swapping the ball joint out, you should also replace the 4 bolts that bolted to the suspension. Another very common issue with these cars is a broken tailgate latch handle, as shown. The handle itself, along with the surrounding trim piece, are both made of plastic. The tailgate is very heavy, and there's a lot of stress placed on these two components when the tailgate is opened. The handle itself is pretty easy to replace, and there's even a reinforced metal one available online. The plastic trim piece surrounding it, however, is a little more expensive, especially because it's a painted part. If you manage to find a Sequoia with these two parts intact and you want to keep it that way, the safe way to open the tailgate is by pulling up on the metal part at the bottom instead of the plastic handle, as shown. If the car looks good so far and doesn't have any major rust on the body or frame, you can pop the hood open and start checking the various fluids and components under there. We'll start with a basic depiction of what we're gonna inspect and where it's located under the hood. Up at the front of the engine bay, you've got the radiator, and to its left, the power steering fluid reservoir, followed by the dipstick for the automatic transmission fluid. This dipstick is present only for the model years from 2001 through 2004. Next up is the heater tee, which is a plastic fitting that carries coolant from the engine block into the heater core in the car, the brake fluid reservoir and the brake booster, and finally the engine oil filler cap and the engine oil dipstick. We'll start with the radiator. The radiator on these cars, as it ages, goes from black to yellowish or brown. At this point, it needs to be changed. Take a look at the coolant overflow reservoir and make sure that the coolant is at the right level and between the two marks. If the vehicle is cold, you can open up the radiator cap to check the level and condition of the fluid inside. The correct type of coolant for this car is Toyota Super Long Life coolant, which is pink in color, and the fluid level in the radiator should be all the way to the top. Make sure the upper radiator hose is nice and flexible and not hard and brittle by pinching it. These type of clamps that you see here, which are called constant tension type hose clamps, are the only correct ones. Next, we move on to the power steering fluid reservoir. Depending on whether the fluid is hot or cold, make sure that the fluid level is correct as shown. An important thing to check is what kind of fluid is present in the reservoir. A common error is to use power steering fluid. Even though this may sound counterintuitive, Toyota recommends we use Dexron 2 or 3 automatic transmission fluid in place of power steering fluid. The fluid should be red in color and sweet to smell. Using any kind of fluid other than the recommended one can cause a lot of damage to the power steering system. Up next is the automatic transmission fluid dipstick. The level of the fluid can be checked only when the car is running and it has been brought up to operating temperature. However, we can have a look at the condition of the fluid. The correct type of fluid is Toyota Type 4 ATF. It should be pinkish red in color and smell sweet and not burnt. If the fluid looks excessively dark or smells burnt, it's best to walk away, as this may mean that the transmission is damaged internally or it hasn't been maintained very well with regular fluid changes. To the right, we have the heater tee fitting. This is a plastic fitting that carries hot coolant from the engine block to the heater core inside the car. It's a common failure point on these engines, and if it fails, it can dump out coolant and lead to overheating of the engine. Just inspect it to see if there is any pink coolant residue around it or in the area immediately below it, which could point to a leak that needs to be fixed. Next up is the brake fluid reservoir. Make sure the fluid is at the right level as shown. Remove the cap and have a look at the fluid. It should be light yellow in color. Old brake fluid is much darker in color and should be flushed out and replaced to avoid damage to the braking system and ensure good braking performance. The final item on this list is the engine oil condition and level. Before checking the level, make sure that the vehicle itself is on level ground to get an accurate reading. The level of the fluid should be in between the two dots on the dipstick as shown. The color should be light amber in color and not too dark. If the oil looks excessively dark or if you can feel particles in the oil, it's best to walk away. You can also unscrew the engine oil filler cap and inspect the underside. If you see a white, milky looking residue under the cap, it may point to one of two things. It could be a mixture of oil and water vapor, which is fairly benign and occurs when the vehicle is taken on repeated short trips. If this is the case, a nice long trip on the highway should remove all of the water vapor and burn off the residue. The second thing that this could point to is a blown head gasket, which is obviously much more serious. Thankfully, this is pretty rare on these engines and doesn't occur very often unless it is overheated due to low coolant. Over the course of this inspection, I'll be pointing out a few other tests which we can use to rule out a blown head gasket. While we're under the hood, let's have a look at the valve covers. The gaskets in between the valve cover and the head, which are called valve cover gaskets, tend to become brittle and hard as they age, and this causes oil leaks in this area. This also manifests itself in the form of a burning smell under the hood, as the oil leaking from the valve cover gaskets falls on the exhaust manifold, which is right below it, and causes the burning smell. These aren't too hard to fix, but it's good to know if you need to do so. Right up in this area is a very important maintenance item that needs to be performed every 90,000 miles or 6 years. And that's the timing belt, along with its associated components such as the water pump, tensioner, idler, and so on. The timing belt is located behind these two plastic covers, but unfortunately, a visual inspection is no indicator of its current health. The 2UZ engine block on this car is called an interference engine. This means that if the timing belt was to ever snap, valves in the head would come into contact with the pistons in the block, leading to very expensive repairs, maybe even a new engine. The only way to prevent this from happening is to perform the timing belt service religiously every 90,000 miles or 6 years, whichever comes first. Generally, if the service has been done by a shop, You should be able to find a sticker under the hood which states when the replacement was done and at what mileage. You can also check the Carfax of the vehicle or ask the owner for records of previous services to see if this has been done. If you can't find any proof, be prepared to shell out around $1,000 to $1,500 as this is the average cost of a timing belt service on these cars. Now we can go ahead and start the car up. It's always a good idea to have a buddy start the car up while you have a look at the exhaust behind the car. If the car hasn't been started in a while, a little bit of light white smoke is okay, as this is just water evaporating from the tailpipe. If it is very cold outside, it might take longer, but eventually this white smoke should stop. If you see a lot of thick white smoke that continues to be produced even after your test drive, this would be a good time to walk away. Continued production of white smoke can be due to a blown head gasket, which is a very expensive repair to be done. Another characteristic of white smoke produced from a blown head gasket is a sweet smell. This is because coolant is entering the combustion chamber and being burnt and pushed out through the exhaust. If you can see blue smoke coming out the back, this means that oil is being burnt. This can be due to a number of factors such as worn piston rings or leaking valve seals. Both of these are pretty expensive items to fix, so you should probably walk away at this point. Don't forget to give the engine a few light revs to see if you can notice anything odd. The gauge cluster on the Sequoia has 6 different gauges. Out of these, 4 are super important, and we'll be monitoring these as we start the car up and go on the test drive. You've got the oil pressure gauge on the top left, the engine coolant temperature gauge right below it, the tachometer which measures the engine speed in revolutions per minute, and the good old speedometer. A very important test to do before you start the car up is called the lamp test. As you can see, when you insert the key into the ignition cylinder and turn it to the on position, the check engine light should come on, and then turn off when you start the car. This helps you weed out dishonest sellers who may have messed with the check engine light on the dash to hide an issue with the car. At the same time, have a look at the tachometer. On a cold start, the tachometer should read around 1000 RPMs and then settle to around 650 to 750 after the vehicle is sufficiently warmed up. With your foot on the brake and using the column shifter, shift the transmission through the various gears slowly one by one as shown. All the shifts should be nice and smooth, and you shouldn't feel any jerks in the cabin or see any jumps in the tachometer reading. While shifting through the gears one by one, if you can feel a vibration in either drive or reverse, and this vibration goes away when you put the car in neutral, this is most likely due to bad engine or transmission mounts. This is not the end of the world like the head gasket issue, but keep in mind that replacing the mounts involves lifting the engine or the transmission. So if you're not the DIY type, you may want to negotiate with the seller so you can knock the price down a little bit so you can have the mounts replaced at a shop of your choice. This is also a good time to test out the brake booster. Turn the car off and give the brake pedal a few pumps. After 3 or 4 pumps, the pedal should become very firm and hard to depress. Now, while keeping pressure on the pedal with your foot, turn the car on. The pedal should now become much easier to depress as the engine creates the vacuum for the brake booster. If the pedal sinks to the floor while the car is off, or is very hard to press even when the car is on, this is most likely due to a bad brake booster. If you get a chance to do so, try to have a look at the engine bay when the car is turned on. The 2UZ FE engine in this car is supposed to be very smooth, and you shouldn't be hearing any weird noises such as ticking, knocking, or squeaks. Another common issue with this car, especially the earlier model years, are pinhole cracks in the exhaust manifold. These are generally pretty easy to hear as they cause a loud ticking noise in this area. Now we're going to take the car for a spin. During a test drive, it is very important to keep a close eye on the gauge cluster as it gives you a lot of very useful information about the mechanical condition of the car. We'll start our test drive by driving on the neighborhood streets at low speeds, below 35 miles per hour. At such low speeds, there is absolutely no excuse for any kind of vibration or shuddering from the car. If you get the chance to go over speed bumps, monitor how the car's suspension behaves. All you should have is a single rise and a single fall as you go over the bump as shown. If the car bounces excessively or feels very floaty, the shocks may be bad. Now we'll move on to the next phase, driving on the main roads at higher speeds. As you speed up, keep a close eye on the tachometer. The A340 transmission in this car is supposed to be very smooth. Consequently, each shift should be almost imperceptible, and the only indication of a shift even happening should be on the tachometer. Remember to monitor the shifts not only while speeding up, but also while slowing down. The Sequoia is a pretty big car, so it's pretty important that the brakes work well. To test them out, we're gonna do a few panic stops. If the owner of the car is riding with you on your test drive, always let them know you're gonna do this before you do it. The car should stop true and straight and not wander all over the road. Next up is driving on the freeway. This is where you can really stretch the car's legs and get a good idea of its stability at high speeds. While entering the freeway, push the gas pedal all the way down to the floor so you can really put the engine and the transmission through its paces. Keep in mind that whenever you floor the pedal like this, slight jerks during the transmission shifting are okay as it is under a lot of load. Basically what we're doing is creating a high stress environment for the engine and the transmission and seeing if any inherent issues pop up. Just like before, the RPM reading on the tachometer should be nice and smooth without any sudden jumps. While on the freeway, try to drive at varying speeds. The Sequoia is a very well built vehicle and should feel nice and stable at all speeds. The needle on the oil pressure gauge should be in the upper 3/4 area, and the engine coolant temperature gauge should read close to the middle or at the middle. If the vehicle doesn't seem to drive straight and pulls to one side, this may be due to an alignment issue or worn suspension components. If you can hear a howling sound from outside the vehicle near the wheel area, this may be a bad wheel bearing. If you get the chance to do so, try to pull into a parking lot and execute some tight turns. The steering should be tight and responsive, and the steering wheel should be pretty easy to turn. If you notice that the steering wheel requires a lot of effort to turn, it may need a power steering fluid flush or a change of the power steering pump. If you can hear a creaking or a groaning noise while turning, this might be because of worn out steering components such as tie rod ends or steering rack bushings. Also try to have a look at the rack and pinion located under the car. These are called the boots. If you see wetness or drops of power steering fluid on them, it means that the rack and pinion is leaking. If you see a tear on the boot, it is also not a good sign, as this allows water and other debris to enter the inner mechanism and damage the rack and pinion. In both these cases, it needs to be completely replaced. Before you turn the car off, don't forget to check the level of automatic transmission fluid. For this, the engine needs to be running and the transmission in park gear. Remove the dipstick from the guide as shown, wipe it off, and then insert it again. Now you can remove the dipstick and check where the fluid level is at. It should be in this area as marked. So that brings us to the end of today's video. If you liked it and would like to watch more of my content, don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe button down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.